and they also need to contribute to the redirection of financial flows at the client sectoral and national levels. So it's quite obvious that development banks cannot act alone on this agenda. Their activities are dependent on and strongly influenced by shareholder governments. So basically what we'll do during this session is to consider some of the avenues explored today. We'll have a first panel with shareholders. Turn it down maybe. A first panel with shareholders, which I'll have the pleasure to moderate, and then there will be a second discussion, a roundtable discussion with financial institutions, which will be moderated by Claire, my colleague Claire. So my name is Benoît Leguet. I'm the managing director of the Institute for Climate Economics. And the Institute for Climate Economics, I4CE, is also the secretariat of the initiative, the Mainstreaming Climate in Financial Institutions, which is an initiative that is designed to help public and private financial institutions from developed and developing economies mainstream climate considerations into their own activities and operations. That's what you see on the slide behind me. We'll have a panel discussion with 4 speakers. 2 of them are on site and the other ones are remote. So let me please welcome Norbert Gorison. Norbert, if you could join me on stage. Norbert is the Deputy Special Envoy for International Climate Action. He works for the Federal Foreign Office in Germany. Let me also welcome Ahmed Al-Kabani. Ahmed is a Senior Climate Change Specialist at the World Bank Group. And online, we have hopefully at least 1 speaker and possibly 2. Özlem Taskin. Özlem is a policy analyst at the OECD. And has Nancy joined us? Nope. And Nancy Lee will possibly join us later during the side event. Nancy is a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development. And she's also a member of the G20 expert panel, which was tasked with the independent review of multilateral development banks' capital adequacy frameworks. So if Nancy joins us, that's fine. And if she doesn't, I take it other panelists will also mention the G20, the expert panel's work, and notably, Özlem, I count on you to do that if Nancy doesn't join us in the end. So my first question, I would like to conduct this as a roundtable discussion. So no slides, if I'm not mistaken, and I'll ask a number of questions to the panelists. Dear panelists, feel free to join in, to jump in if you have any question, if you want to react. We're flexible, so I will direct you some questions. But then again, if you want to react, just keep the time constraint in mind, and that's about all. Norbert, I would like to start with you, if you agree. A first question directed to you. From the perspective of a major shareholder of MDBs, what are the principal limitations in development banks' capacity to address climate change, including in the triple crisis of COVID-19, conflict and climate? If you could stick to 5 minutes in your initial response, that would be most welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. And I would not comment in my first instance from the perspective of a major shareholder, but more from the perspective of a policymaker who is dealing here with the outcome of this COP, and also interested in contributing to the solution which is needed to address effectively the climate crisis. And I think what is coming more and more clear here in this conference, and that's also underpinned by work we did ahead of the conference, is that the system seems not to be fit for purpose to address the various crises we are in. The crisis of recovery from COVID, now the crisis which were caused by the impacts of the Russian war of aggression, whether it's the food crisis or energy prices, inflation, and of course the climate crisis. And of course the Sustainable Development Goals are also by far not being met. We know they will not be met by 2030. And if you look at all of those crises, you see each of those crises asks for additional funding, additional money to help to manage the crisis, or possibly help to address the crisis and resolve it. Climate seems to be one of the most overarching crises. We have committed as developed countries to mobilize 100 billion per year by 2020. We have failed to do so. Germany and Canada were requested to, or invited to, come up with a delivery plan on when and how that will be met, and the outcome was last year by 2023, and this year we did an update where we did not, or progress report where we did not revise the numbers, but we looked at what happened in the meantime. And what we identified were four particular areas where more work is needed out of 10 actions areas which were addressed last year. So 4 areas are adaptation finance, access to finance, mobilizing more successfully private finance, and the fourth one were the MDBs. And that's what I would like to address here more in detail. We reached out to shareholders, to developing countries, and to the institutions, and we recognize more and more that there is a need for a fundamental reform of their business models. What we heard was shareholders should play a stronger role. They should really coordinate their positions in the boards, and in particular they should request better analytics of the costs of climate change. They should consider this capital adequacy review, which the G20 is running right now. How could we make more out of the capital which is there? But also possibly looking at capital increase, maybe dedicated for climate, creating incentives to borrow specifically in the area of climate mitigation and resilience, and in particular also looking for more concessionality, which is even more important now with the increasing debt distress. And reflecting last week here at COP and what else happened, we heard that if the debate is going even beyond that. And Barbados, the government of Barbados started to initiate a debate which culminated in the Bridgetown agenda, which included not only the MDBs but also the IMF and what could be done with the special drawing rights, and that's called now the Bridgetown agenda. And I think it becomes clear that the thinking has to go far beyond what we can do here in UNFCCC, but maybe even more beyond what we could do in the MDBs as such, even if we would be better, and that we should really consider to launch a debate of reforming the full Bretton Woods systems. And of course that's a debate which cannot happen here, it needs to happen elsewhere, but there's already some requests, in particular for the World Bank, to come up with some reform ideas by the spring meeting next year. Let's see what comes out of that. So I think it's quite interesting at the moment what will be happening over the next 2 years.
Thanks, Norbert. And speaking of the devil, since you mentioned speaking of the devil, since you mentioned the World Bank, well, by chance we have a representative of the World Bank. Well, what limitations have you faced when implementing and designing your Paris alignment plans? And the question to you is, how could shareholders be supportive of your action?
Thank you, Benoit, and thank you, Norbert, for opening the question in this way. As rightly mentioned, there's been a lot of discussions on this, but we're focused on what we have right now and identifying where the gaps are, and that management at the bank, and I believe that other MDBs are looking into those asks from our shareholders for sure. But to zoom in into Paris alignment specifically, because this is one of the key issues, one of the key things that we've been working on at the World Bank and at other MDBs as well for quite some time. And we do see some obstacles and things that we would want support in. So I'll zoom in, and one of the things that Norbert, you kindly elaborate is the data part and the analytics part, which now looking into how we're rolling out Paris alignment and how we're going to, this will affect all of our work or our pipelines or our relationship with our client countries. Having proper analytics that identify the low carbon pathways, the low carbon and resilient development pathways is one of the key things that we see a lot of support that is needed. Now, NDCs, some of them are getting better, but they still don't go far enough, they're not ambitious enough. Very few long-term strategies in our client countries. And these really set the path forward. And this is where we've ramped up a lot of our effort to support our countries and working with our client countries and clients, even the private sector, to try to prepare those and forge those. Now, another thing that we've been doing also to identify what are those pathways where the long-term strategies do not exist. The bank has put climate, as I'm sure you've been hearing a lot on this COP, climate and development working together, and we've launched now many of our many country climate and development reports, CCDRs. We've launched over 24, I think 24 of them by this COP. And here we're bringing climate at the forefront with our development agenda. So, and this is very important because when we talk about Paris alignment, we're not just talking about the sectors that are energy, transport, but we're also talking about the multitude of sectors where we support development and alleviating poverty. Even social sectors. And as you rightly mentioned, we cannot forget SDGs. We're development banks at the end of the day. But now this is us bringing climate at the forefront with all the other SDGs at the heart of everything we do, and then identifying how can we work better to support our client countries on this front. And what we hope to do is that this becomes our center for dialogue, engagement with our clients and with our development partners, even with the other MDBs, our development partners, and we want them to get involved in this. These documents are what we call core World Bank analytics. It's a World Bank document, but we believe they're global public goods that should be used by our client countries and our partners to pave the way. And then we know in different sectors, this is how we get to the SDGs in the different sectors, but in a low carbon and resilient manner. And we need these analytics. And this is here we need a lot of concessional financing. We need a lot of policy support and concessional financing from our shareholders and the donor countries to go into supporting these, because there's no time, and currently we weren't equipped, and there's no time to wait for many LTSs to be produced before we start acting. So we're all committed to Paris alignment. We need to act now. Our portfolios, our dialogue is being aligned now as we speak. We have people working in the bank throughout all the World Bank and MDBs towards that, and we need these analytics to be available yesterday. So I'll stop here and hopefully we'll continue the next round.
Thanks, Ahmed. Turning to you, Özlem, if you can hear us. If I'm not mistaken, the OECD has been working for a number of years on the role of donor shareholders in raising development banks' climate ambition and action. You've heard Norbert, you've heard Ahmed. What they've said, does it reflect your policy recommendations? I hope it is the case. Özlem?
If you can hear me?
Yes.
All good? Okay, great. Just to say that definitely the input from Norbert and also from Ahmed very much resonate with our findings. Development banks are key institutions. And in fact, I will go so far as to say that the transition in developing countries will not happen if development banks are not on board. Also taking up some of the input that Norbert has mentioned, the question is, are development banks fit for purpose today to be able to help countries, transform their development pathways in order for development banks to really get there and embrace this agenda, internalize it and make it stronger. And also in line with the recent calls that we have heard about, in particular with the view to the annual meetings, our work also highlights that we're not there yet, and in fact we need to rethink development banking for climate. Benoit, you mentioned already in your introduction that development banks, they don't act in a vacuum, but they are strongly influenced by shareholder governments. So our research highlights that scaling up development banks' climate ambition requires governments, and in particular donor shareholder governments, to focus on three main elements. The first is ambition. Development banks need stronger mandates, underpinned by performance and incentive systems, your reporting systems, key performance indicators on climate. Much stronger mandates, and shareholders are in place to help them do this. The UN Secretary General recently included this point in an op-ed where he urged government shareholders to put in place ambitious targets for investments in renewable energy infrastructure. So that's the first point, ambition. The second point that we think the donor shareholders really need to push forward is to support development banks to move from what they are right now, which is financiers of infrastructure. They need to move from this, more traditional role and go towards being mobilizers of commercial capital. Again, Norbert also mentioned these 4 key points, and one of them is mobilization. This frankly means a significant rethink of their business model, but this is what they need to do to remain relevant in order to help countries transform their development. They need to be mobilizing much larger shares, much larger sums of capital for the climate transition. Again, with a little bit of an outside view, US Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen outlined also about a month ago that development banks' operating models, they need to change, and they need stronger targets for mobilizing private capital into their projects. And then third and finally, shareholder governments of development banks, they need to be providing concessional capital. So also a point that both Norbert and Ahmed mentioned just now. This concessional capital, can help development banks to really get into the places where it's a little bit more difficult to act on climate. Important that concessional capital is used most usefully, targeting it towards areas where it can have the highest climate impact. This is in particular important when we think about policy support and capacity building for development banks. For example, to put in place, more ambitious NDCs, implement them and finance them, but also with a view to long-term low emission strategies that Ahmed has mentioned. It's also important with a view to improving diagnostics of, both climate change, what's happening, but then also climate action. And then Norbert mentioned the OECD Climate Finance 100 Billion report, where we also highlight in this edition that grants represented a larger share of climate finance for SIDS, for LDCs, and for fragile states compared to developing countries overall. So providing this concessional capital is also crucial to advance climate action in these contexts. I'll leave it at that. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, Özlem. Turning to Nancy. Nancy, can you hear us? Oops. Yes, well, you've been part of the G20 expert panel tasked with I'll read the full title, the independent review of MDB's capital adequacy frameworks. Is there any connection, since there is no climate in the title, is there any connection between the report and climate change? And if so, could you elaborate in a couple of minutes on the key recommendations of the report?
Sure, and there absolutely is a connection, and it's very good to have a discussion of the report in this context. Basically, the consequences of capital adequacy policy decisions are critical for climate finance. The second point really is that MDB multilateral development bank capital now is underutilized and could be used more efficiently to produce more lending capacity. So those are the 2 fundamental conclusions of the report. Quantitatively, what we found was implementation of the report's recommendations at scale across the 15 institutions that we were asked to review could drive hundreds of billions of dollars of increased lending capacity. So the stakes are really quite high and very relevant to this conversation. Just to summarize the report's recommendations, they're grouped in, let's say, 3 buckets. First, assigning some value to what's called callable capital in the MDBs, a substantial part of shareholders' capital subscriptions. Second, deploying financial innovations that create more usable capital. And third, engaging credit rating agencies and private investors to promote more accurate risk assessment for MDB credits. Under the first bucket, the report recommends giving some value to a prudent share of callable capital. as credit rating agencies actually do, but most MDBs do not. Callable capital is essentially a guarantee that government shareholders offer to cover the extremely unlikely risk of an MDB default, which has never happened. So credit rating agencies recognize that that guarantee has value and provides what they call uplift for it in their ratings. So we are proposing that MDBs do the same thing using whatever methodologies are appropriate for their particular circumstances. And this change would not require changing MDB charters or governance, and it certainly would not change the extremely low probability of a call on callable capital. Bucket 2 is innovations, and basically what that means is offloading risk to either private insurers or people interested in actually buying MDB assets, or to third-party guarantors like government shareholders, or the MIGA, which is part of the World Bank. It includes issuing hybrid capital to allow private investors not only to buy MDB bonds, but to buy a hybrid capital instrument, which would also increase the available capital to institutions, which could be leveraged in more lending. And it includes pooling callable capital commitments in times of crisis in order to allow the MDBs to surge their lending to respond to more for short-term crises as opposed to the longer-term issues that we need more lending from MDBs for. And then the last bucket includes a number of things, but most fundamentally includes using MDB data as a public good, which will allow all the key actors to more accurately assess the risk of MDB credits. And I'm talking about credits both to governments and to the private sector. What we found as a panel is that what's called MDB preferred creditor status, which is their preference over other creditors in repayments, has a lot of value, and therefore MDB credit performance is actually much better than comparable commercial institutions, and therefore the risk of MDB credits is lower, which means that if the risk were accurately assessed, then the amount of capital that MDBs would have to put aside against their lending would be considerably stronger. So just that greater transparency would have really very significant benefits, and is very possible given a sufficient commitment of resources and political will by the MDBs. So let me just say, finish by saying 4 things. Number 1, the recommendations are mutually reinforcing. So some of the recommendations which would just marginally increase leverage in the institutions are balanced by recommendations that increase the amount of available capital. Second, it would be much better if MDBs collaborated and moved forward on this agenda together so that no institution faces first mover costs and risks alone. Third, the benefits are not just for MDB lending capacity, they're also for crowding private investors in at scale in ways that the MDBs, as we just heard, have not been able to do. But I would stress the last point, and we should, as we continue this conversation, I assume we'll get into it, which is this is not a substitute for capital increases for the MDBs. It's rather a complement in the sense of you can make a better case to shareholders for more capital if you convince shareholders that MDBs are using existing capital as efficiently as possible.
All right, thanks, Nancy. We'll have a second round of questions. We are on time, and I'll ask the panelists to remain concise in their answers. They've done an extraordinary job so far. My second question to Norbert would be, what would be the changes in the mandate, the strategies, or the business model of development banks that could be considered to ensure that they best contribute to mobilization and the alignment of financial flows?
Thank you, and thanks for the interesting contributions from colleagues also. I think what we expect development banks, MDBs and DFIs be doing is being in particular, as has been said, able to mobilize rather than only finance projects, mobilize programs, mobilize transformations at large. And in order to do that, first of all, they need a very clear mandate, or how should I call it? Yeah, I think I would call it a mandate. At least they should own this as a central part of their operations to deliver on the Paris Agreement, and doing what is possible in order to limit 1.5, to limit temperature increase to 1.5. So some of the banks are already calling themselves climate banks. I know that the EIB is calling it like that, and KfW is also doing it sometimes. So I think that goes in this direction, and that climate cannot be longer being one of many objectives. It needs to become one core objectives, because the global transition is at stake. If I look at the obstacles, I think there is a number of internal procedures which you have to think of, trainings, internal assessments, but also the organization. Quite often the sector units or the sector departments have less impact than the country desks or the country offices. Country offices in the countries quite often listen too closely, I would say, to their clients. They're too close to them, and in the end they are the deciding ones. So the question is really what we can do in order to revise that. The previous World Bank president, he has set up a very complicated organization, which I'm not fully convinced that it was successful, but at least it had this vision, to really bring the sectoral units and closer to the operations on the countryside, a matrix concept. But I also think it is needed to look at the incentives for the managers in the banks. As long as incentives are purely look at the biggest possible volume of your deal, and that decides on what you have in your pocket in the end, I'm not sure whether that's the right incentive. So if we can do something in order to make incentives dependent also on the impact on climate of the projects and deals or programs the managers are responsible for, that could have a big impact. And of course, I think we should not be too cautious with all of that. I think it's clear that really changing the operations of the MDBs and DFIs towards aligning more to Paris, there's no very clear benchmark for that, how to do that. We don't have best practice. We have to learn what we are doing, and we may consider this works, this work not, but I think it's not an excuse to be too slowly in the needed revision of procedures and organizations, because in the end, one of the overarching problems we have here in the conference when we talk about the climate crisis is, yes, we're doing a lot, there's things are moving in the right direction, but by far not at the scale and by far not with the speed which is needed. And in that situation, we cannot afford to be too cautious with our approaches. So let's test it and revise. Once we have found this is not leading in the right direction, we need to revise it. I don't think that's a problem. I don't think we should be too cautious about that. And yeah, let me leave it at that. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Norbert. I guess everyone's going to talk about the World Bank, so we'll let Ahmed be the last to react. Nancy, turning to you, at this year's annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, shareholders instructed the World Bank to develop a work program for its own evolution. So one of the main reform priorities and what are some of the opportunities you would see in forging the change agenda?
Thanks very much. And while we're focusing on the World Bank, we need to be sure to understand the power of the whole system. I mean, the MDB system is a system now with about, if you look at all of the 15 major multilateral development banks, they have a total of something like 500.
Nancy, we are, hang on, if you could just hang on 2 minutes, because it's quite noisy on our end of the wire. Sorry. Hang on. Yeah, I guess you can resume. Sorry about that, about the interruption.
Okay.
Yeah, could you please start over? Yeah, start over, because I guess we just didn't hear the last 30 seconds or a minute of what you were saying.
I just was making the point to start that we can focus on the World Bank, but the system is much bigger than the World Bank. If you look at the major 15 multilateral development banks, they have a collective total of about $500 billion of equity from their shareholders, and they currently have something like 1.4 trillion in development assets and development lending. So this is a time when we really need to talk about the system as a whole, as essential, and really the only set of institutions we have that is capable of getting to the scale that we need, the trillions of dollars year in and year out in order to meet this challenge. So I would say the set of reforms includes one set that has to do with additional finance and another set of reforms that has to do with how the MDBs operate. And it's really important to bring those two together. There is a tendency to focus on the size of finance without talking about the reforms. So on the size of finance, it seems to us, and we've been publishing a fair amount about this in the Center for Global Development, the size of finance has to be boosted by 4 elements. Number one, implementation of the Capital Adequacy Report recommendations to achieve these hundreds of billions of dollars of additional lending I was just talking about. Number two, general capital increases. We cannot avoid the reality that to get to that scale, there needs to be general capital increases. And after all, after the global financial crisis, which was a much smaller shock to the developing world, every major multilateral development bank got additional capital. So there's every rationale for more capital at this stage. Number three, consolidation of donor concessional finance, grant finance for climate. In the World Bank alone, there's more than 50 entities that provide climate finance. As many, I'm sure, during these days of conversation have said, it's very hard to access that fragmented and uncoordinated system. So there's got to be a way to use that very scarce grant finance more efficiently. And number four, find a way to use the SDR allocation to reallocate it in ways that can allow additional lending from the MDBs. And there are several proposals out there, including one that would use SDRs to add to MDB capital and therefore leverage it. So this is the time to move forward with those four. And then on the reform side, very briefly, as the World Bank representative was already saying, really move forward with integrating climate, both adaptation and mitigation, into country programs, but also incentivize countries to allocate more of their finance to climate-related activities. And as Secretary Yellen said during the annual meetings, that can involve using some concessional finance, that is below market finance, to incentivize middle-income countries to spend more on things that have spillover positive benefits for countries beyond its own borders, beyond their own borders. So that's really important about part reform. Third, shift to more catalytic instruments. This is not just about MDB lending. MDBs could be doing guarantees, insurance, equity, things that actually mobilize more private finance. So there needs to be a shift out of just straight senior lending to things that actually fill capital market gaps and therefore unlock more private finance. The MDBs really need to collaborate more with each other, and I would advocate that there needs to be a structure that brings the MDBs together as alongside relevant UN agencies to collaborate on common targets and monitor the implementation of those targets. It's simply no longer sufficient for this to be done by individual boards and individual MDBs without collaboration in order to share risk, share the development costs of these projects, and share exposure to the risks. And then finally, the other part of the reform agenda is to target not just climate finance inputs, which is what we've seen so far, but to target climate outcomes so that we can get closer to what, so the MDBs can really try to start quantifying their contribution to the climate outcomes and therefore the resultant temperature changes that we need to get to. So it's no longer sufficient to say each year, you know, if we've contributed 60 billion to this, the MDBs need to work together on a methodology to figure out how to quantify what they're contributing to climate outcomes.
All right, thanks, Nancy. Özlem, as Nancy pointed out, it's not only the World Bank and it's not only MDBs. Now the OECD is looking at the whole ecosystem of multi-binational, subnational financial institutions, development financial institutions. Can you see what are some of the emerging good, if not best, but at least good practices that you see emerging?
Sure, happy to. And if okay, when honing in on these emerging good practice approaches that we see, I'd like to focus on mobilization, just because that was also, at least from what I heard, one of the key items both of Norbert's and Nancy's intervention just now.
Okay.
Yeah, we looked at, for a number of years already, at a number of development banks at different levels, right, all the way from multilateral to the subnational development banks. And interestingly, a national development bank, the Development Bank of Southern Africa, provides, from our point of view, a helpful case to highlight the role of shareholders in enabling development banks to evolve from, you know, the sole financer to mobilizer. There are three elements that I think are worth highlighting, in particular when we look at, you know, these internal procedures that Norbert has mentioned, organizations, what needs to happen internally in these organizations. First, shifting institutional focus towards mobilization. So the shareholder of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, which in this case is the National Treasury of South Africa, they actually reduce their expectations for return on equity in order to allow the bank, you know, to engage in activities beyond loan provision, a point that Nancy has mentioned. For example, to facilitate market creation, developing capacity for different public and private actors, and also support policy strengthening. And lowering expectations on ROE, so on return on equity, also enables banks, you know, more generally speaking, to engage in higher risk activities and to mobilize private finance in contexts, you know, where mobilization is currently not yet taking place. And this is again one of the key recent asks of Guterres, Yellen, Motley, and others, where they say we need to increase the risk tolerance of development banks. So lowering the expectations for return on equity actually proved something highly important for, or crucial for, the Development Bank of Southern Africa. Then secondly, to further increase the focus on mobilization, Development Bank, the DBSA, and again its shareholder enabled it to do it, but they introduced, they reduced the disbursement target, and at the same time simultaneously introduced the mobilization target in the strategic objectives and corporate scorecard. So it's not just about adding, you know, a new element to what development banks need to do, in this case mobilization, but at the same time they also reduce the disbursement target. Yeah, so this just to better integrate, I guess, mobilization into the DNA of the development bank. And then third, DBSA created dedicated capacity for mobilization and more upstream processes. In this way, DBSA was able to rewire its organizational structure, again, away from direct financing and towards a stronger institutional outlook of mobilization. And what this meant in practice, really unpacking it, was that DBSA created dedicated offices and resources for mobilization and capitalization, as well as broader, pre-financing functions. So project preparation, programmatic approaches, planning, you name it. And creating these units elevated the visibility and also the prioritization of these functions and objectives within the bank. So again, moving from sole financing more towards mobilizing and catalyzing. And these units really focused on, bringing in new actors, supporting market creation for a longer-term scaling up of clean infrastructure, and did not necessarily focus on the outcome of loan provision. So just three key elements, at least from what we can tell from our analysis, on emerging good practice approaches to focus more on mobilization and less so on, your sole loan provision and loan financing.
Thanks, Özlem. Now turning to Ahmed, you've heard Özlem, Nancy, and Norbert. How could these changes contribute to the alignment of Paris, of international financial institutions toward the Paris Agreement? Do you see anything that you would like to react on, or anything you would like to add?
Thank you. I think maybe there's like 30 points that I would like to react to, but there's no time for that.
In 3 minutes.
So I'll try to maybe focus on the big ones. And thank you, Norbert, for mentioning how the realignment internally is important. Now, I'll just start by giving a chapeau reaction for a lot of things that were mentioned. Yes, the recommendations have been received by the G20 and the shareholders, and management is reacting to that. And many of them actually we welcome, and we look forward to them because they give us more space. They're going to hopefully they give us more resources, more fiscal space, and we welcome those, and we look forward to seeing the next steps. And I think this is something that is being looked into by our management at the World Bank. Now I can focus on things that we're already doing, and hopefully we can only see increasing. I'll go back to the first point, the CCDRs and the system transformation. This is quite transformational, not just with our clients, but even internally. And to give you an example, Norbert, responding to how the institutions are moving. On one single CCDR, you're talking about from 100 to 200 World Bank staff between our regional office, our global practice, from climate change, from our economists that are actually working with the government and internalizing how we do climate with our development goals. And this is something, so beyond the value and beyond what you're seeing being presented on the results, which we see as very valuable and hopefully just the starting point to build on, this is really a game changer. This is really transformational within the World Bank, having this number of people internalize climate in their work. And hopefully with the recommendations and with giving us more fiscal space, we see this more and more action and more financing coming in this direction towards both climate and the SDGs. So I wanted to start with that this motion, it's already happening. The second thing that also would be good to comment on, I heard something on the trust funds. We had a whole trust fund reform inside the bank, I think a couple of years ago, where we have umbrella trust funds that actually speak to each other. So it's not as fragmented as you think. Of course, we could still do better. And currently, we actually need more financing for that. I think we've heard in the recommendations from every speaker about the need for constitutionality. I'll maybe flag two. The climate support facility, supporting the analytics and guiding our way at the country level and guiding our programming at the country level. It's been supported with very generous contribution from Germany, from BMZ, but there is more and more, we're receiving more and more requests, and we want to expand. We are also, with the climate support facility, there's the LTS, the MDB LTS facility working with the climate support facility that we're talking on with the MDBs, showing how we're actually working with our fellow MDBs and trying to have a coordinated approach, especially at the upstream, and supporting the countries as they move towards their Paris alignment goals. We also have scale, speaking of financial instruments. This was just launched last week by the World Bank president, and here we're looking at results-based financing and looking into carbon credits and how can we expand this results-based financing with verified results, and how can we scale this and use this for more climate action, so that in essence it's like a revolving fund. We establish results and we move forward. Now we need support for this. We need more concessional financing of this. Now, as I said, a lot of those capital adequacy framework recommendations are most welcome. They'll give us more breathing space. They'll enable us to do more. hopefully get more people to work on these issues. But we've already been internalizing many of this, and movement is in motion. You know, we're boarding more with policy-based lending. We're doing more with our colleagues in MIGA, as I see my colleagues from MIGA walking in, and de-risking facilities, and de-risking and combining bank financing, IBRD and IDA with MIGA financing, and we see more of those in more countries. Now, hopefully we get more support from our donor countries, from our shareholders, and hopefully get to expand more and more on this work. Happy to elaborate more. I know I'm out of time, and I know you want to move on, so I'll stop here, and thank you.
Thanks, Ahmed. It's time for a little bit of interaction with the audience, if you guys agree. I will wrap up the first series of the roundtable with a final question, but before that I would like to try and interact with the audience. Do we have any questions or any statement from the floor?
Hello and good afternoon. My name is Wouter Meinertsma and I work for the European Investment Bank. Norbert, in the beginning you said the stakeholders need to get more influence, and I'm quite curious what you mean by that, because I'm very frankly, I'm speaking just for myself here on personal title. When you have a lot of stakeholders that always want something different, it makes it very difficult to move forwards. And as the EU bank, we have only the EU as stakeholders, and that allowed us to very quickly move ahead in this Paris alignment space. And if you also have China and the US and Russia and everything as your stakeholders, that makes it much more complicated. So yeah, I'm wondering if we should be careful what we wish for if we ask for more intervention from our stakeholders. But maybe I didn't fully understand the message behind that statement.
Any other question or a statement? What I'd like, I mean, if you have any question, please ask it now. What we'll do afterwards is I will direct the questions to the panel, and they will answer whichever question they want to answer, and forget to answer whichever question they do not want to answer. So if there's any other statement question. All right, it doesn't seem to be the case. Well, you only have one question. Do you guys want to answer? Ladies first. I see Nancy nodding. Nancy?
Yeah, I just wanted to observe on this question of multiple stakeholders that we saw, I think, some progress during the annual meetings of the IMF and World Bank in October, in the sense that I think we got past the notion that there is a trade-off between the mandate of the bank to reduce poverty and promote shared prosperity, as well as this additional focus on global public goods, but particularly in the climate sphere. Because I think, at least in a lot of the conversations, there was this notion that they have to be pursued together. And that was certainly emphasized from the developing country side and the emerging market side, that they can't be asked now to shift focus on some very fundamental development priorities. But it was also emphasized on the rich country side, that, and this was very explicitly part of certainly the US message, that it has to be done together. And the CCDRs are clearly, as described, promoting exactly that kind of focus. So I think there probably will have to be more changes operationally in the World Bank in order to actually move the priorities that come out of the CCDRs forward in terms of decisions about finance. But I think that at least is moving in the right direction. The point, though, is the rub comes in terms of the scale of finance, because while conceptually there should not be a trade-off, if there's not enough finance to pursue these additional priorities, just the arithmetic will force the trade-off. So I think we haven't yet gotten to the point where particularly the major shareholders have really decided what they want to do, both in terms of concessional finance and in terms of capital increases. But I hope we get to it very quickly, maybe in time for the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, because you know, the stakeholders need to come together, not just conceptually about integrating climate issues, but they need to come together on how to scale the finance in order to do that.
Thank you for the question, but I'm not quite sure what I said, that stakeholders should have more influence. That sounds strange. Of course they have shareholders, not the stakeholders. Yeah, of course I talked about shareholders, and I think they could have a stronger voice, and that's what I had in mind if they are better coordinated. There's attempts of a group of shareholders, like-minded shareholders, to do that, and that's a starting perhaps to put a little bit more push towards the management, not only to the IMDb, the World Bank, by the way. Fully right, there are more banks. If I mentioned sometimes the MDBs, I know the World Bank, I know it's not a World Bank discussion here, it's a discussion about all of them. The problem with the shareholder coordination is that it is in principle divided, first of all, between clients and capital owners, more or less. And secondly, that the shareholder community is not really owning the sustainability and climate topic in the same way as we would do here in this room. So I think that is where more could be done, but it's on the way. I wouldn't complain too much, because I know there's a lot of discussions among shareholders. Other ministries talk to the finance ministries, who in many cases have a seat on the board, in order to come up with a more with a position which is fully owned of the government, of the shareholders, and that was not natural. When I started in this business to observe it, it was really a separate place, and what the board directors did in the bank was hardly discussed really with the rest of the shareholder government. That has changed, and it's good. So I think that's what I mean. This evolvement in this direction, and then also perhaps having a better conversation between the shareholders from the south and the north, in order to come to a common agreement. Because we hear in the rooms here quite often when we have texts where the MDBs are asked to contribute better or more to climate finance, to be better aligned to Paris, that some of the parties here react allergically against that and tell them these are development banks, they have nothing to do with climate, and they're shrinking the space for our development priorities. I think that's where more debate is needed. Or I think the times where we can trade development against climate is over. So without climate, there's no development, and one can do both things together. But simply saying, okay, let's go on with the old way, and then in 5 years we fix the climate problem, is not going to work. But you're nodding.
Thank you. I can react to that, and we're in full agreement. So we're not saying they're exclusive, and we're not saying there's a trade-off. If anything, actually, we had the synthesis report on the first batch of CCDRs that says up to 70% of emission reduction while maintaining growth can done without any single trade-off or any single tool. And part in the 24 or 28 countries that were covered by the 24. So, which is exactly what you're saying, Norbert, but with analytics behind that push growth in our countries. We'd like to remain close to our client countries, our developing, and we try to remain responsive, understand their needs, but we're working with them at the upstream and the policy level to forge those development pathways while they ensure their growth, reducing poverty, while addressing the Paris goals, both adaptation and mitigation, and we're full agreement on that. And this is why we welcome all the support from our development partners and shareholders, definitely. And one thing to show, maybe something to flag, we have a World Bank Paris alignment event today at 6, where we actually shed some light on where we are. So, colleagues are welcome to join. This will be at the World Bank Pavilion at 6 p.m. today, and we welcome these questions, and we look forward to being hopefully Paris aligned by July 2023. So, I'll pass. Thank you.
All right, thanks Norbert, Ahmed. Özlem, is there anything you would like to add, either in reaction or something, a missing bit that we would have missed out?
No, not a missing bit, but just to reiterate what colleagues have mentioned earlier. I think good climate policy is good development policy. Climate action and progress on sustainable development are very much inseparably linked. If we want to build, if we want to safeguard and build on development gains of the past, we need to address climate change. Yeah, maybe it's just more putting this common narrative, that it's actually not a trade-off, that the two go hand in hand. Yeah, just to reiterate those elements.
Okay, thanks Özlem. Now I believe it's time to wrap up the first series of presentations. Before I thank the panelists, I would have one final question for them. It's the end of COP27 is looming. Christmas also, or any other celebration that you could think of. If you have one thing to ask to someone at the surface of Earth, what would it be? And who would you direct your query to? Now you have 30 seconds to think about it, and I would like one-liners, 30-second responses. What and who would you direct it to? Your Christmas wish, so to speak.
Should I go first?
Yeah, please, Özlem.
Okay, now happy to. For me, the wish would go to the donor shareholders. 3 elements, I think, for good donorship in the face of climate change. Stronger mandates underpinned by KPIs on climate and mobilizations. Second, enable development banks transition into mobilizers. And then thirdly, the provision of concessional capital to enable the transition. As my end of COP27 Christmas wish list.
All right. Nancy, what's your Christmas wish? Or end of COP27?
I would ask the heads of the multilateral development banks, along with their shareholders, to set climate outcomes targets, collective climate outcome targets, to define Paris alignment, not in terms of the types of activities that are chosen, but in terms of the actual climate adaptation and mitigation outcomes. And then I would ask them to form a collaborative body to collectively pursue those targets and be held accountable to them. Thanks.
Thanks, Nancy. Ahmed?
It's not an ask, it's a I wish, maybe, that very soon. I've seen the large number of my colleagues working at the MDBs and at the World Bank internally towards Paris alignment, towards developing actually metrics, results metrics that we're already working on, and hopefully we hope to be seeing soon inside the World Bank and with other MDBs. Also towards mobilizing finance through our trust funds. So I see all of this work being built internally at the World Bank and in other MDBs. So maybe my wish is maybe very soon we start seeing results on the ground in our client countries where we're reducing prosperity and addressing our climate goals. So that's my wish.
I would add a wish which is more COP specific. We had the European Union was coming here with the request or with the wish to have an agenda item on Article 21C being included in the agenda. This was not accepted, so therefore I want to see strong language in the outcome document which hints towards the direction of the overall reform of the multilateral international financial system.
All right. Well, thanks to you for this COP27 Christmas whatever wish list. I would like to thank you for this eye resting discussion, because we had no PowerPoint presentation. I guess if you would like to join me in a round of applause to our panelists. And I will hand over the floor to Claire. Claire is a senior project manager at the Institute for Climate Economics, and she's also the head of the secretariat at the Mainstreaming Climate in Financial Institutions. Claire, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Benoit. It's loud. And thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks to all the panelists also. So we're going to have a we're going to start off now with the second part of the discussion. So we've heard a lot about the institutional reform and the broader picture. And now we'd like to invite on stage a set of panelists from financial institutions who are going to talk to us a little bit more about the operational instruments that we can use to have this transformative impact and see how in practice these can work out. So thank you for the introduction, but I won't introduce myself again. I'd probably just like to add a couple of words on the Mainstreaming Climate in Financial Institutions initiative. So we're an initiative that brings together 50 financial institutions, a little bit over 50 financial institutions. And so we work on with these financial institutions to provide a place where they can share their best practices and also lead by example. So we're very much in touch with these different financial institutions and lucky enough to be able to have direct access to what they've been doing. So we've invited a few of them to talk to us a little bit about what they've been doing, and I'll probably ask them to come up on stage right now, and then I'll also bring up, because I see Alice is busy, so I'll bring up our two presentators who'll be also sharing some work that they've been doing. So I'll start by calling up on stage our four panelists. So we have, I see him there, we have Alexis Bonnel, who's Senior Advisor, Foresight, Climate and Sustainable Development with the French Development Agency. We also have Dana Kupova, who's Associate Director, Head of Green Economy Transition, Financial Institution Business Group for the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. We'll also be having with us Vito Dellerba, who I see over there, who's from the Caisse des Dépôts et Placements du Québec, so the Quebec's Deposit and Investment Fund. I'm sorry, I don't have your exact title. Maybe you could give it to us a bit later on. So maybe you can all join us up on stage, if that's okay. And we'll also be having online with us Elvin Afandi, Division Head, Economic Policy and Research from the Islamic Corporation for Development of the Private Sector, ICD. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us online as well. Okay, so maybe to start off, we're going to have a couple of presentations to set the scene of our discussion on two different financial instruments that have been increasingly used by our financial institutions to have this transformative impact and catalytic effect we were talking about during the first session. And I think we're going to start with you, Anya, who's going to be talking us through your recent work on policy-based instruments. So, Anya, sorry, your, just don't want to mess up your name. You're Policy Advisor for German Watch. Anya Gebel, Policy Advisor for German Watch. And I believe, yes, sorry, we'll be starting the presentation with you. Thank you very much. You can either sit down or stand up, whichever is easiest for you. Pardon? You need the mic. Yeah, I'm going to pass the mic to you, and you have the clicker.
Okay, so shall I start? Okay. So hello, I'm Anja Gebel, working with German Watch as a policy advisor on development banks and climate. And I'm going to speak on the topic of aligning multilateral development banks' policy-based finance with the Paris Agreement. And I'm going to start with a couple of introductory points on why this is an important topic. So the way in which this instrument, policy-based operations, works is that countries receive a general budget support in exchange for implementing policy reforms agreed upon with the banks. And we know that governments request policy-based operations usually to implement reform packages for different development goals, but also to support macroeconomic stability, for example, in times of crisis. And these operations make up for a considerable share of bank commitments. That's what we see here. So this can range from 10 to 25% in a typical year to 30 and up to 60% during a crisis such as COVID-19. And given that policy-based operations are a relatively quick way to financial stabilization during times of crisis, it's also likely that they will actually become even more important in the future. And also in the context of the just energy transition partnerships that are currently negotiated, they're increasingly being regarded as important elements to support the energy policy transformations. Is there a technical problem? No? Okay, you can hear me fine? Okay. So even if experiences and also evidence for the success of climate-related policy-based operations are still limited, there's still reasons to believe that the potential of policy-based operations actually extends beyond the energy sector and that they could play an important role in supporting ambitious climate policy also more generally, and like this maximize development outcomes. So because one thing depends on the other, as we just also discussed. However, in our research on policy-based operations, we found that so far the PBO formulation process, so the process in which leads up to the formulation of policy actions in PBOs, does not sufficiently consider climate risks and does not systematically identify opportunities for green development. And also that staff incentives are insufficient for consistently integrating climate action in PBOs. And this can result in policy actions that support climate problematic economic activities, which in turn increase countries' exposure to climate risks and delay the transition. So this highlights the importance of Paris alignment, and based on these insights, we're suggesting that for a policy-based operation to be in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement, it needs to be ensured that its policy actions do not increase macroeconomic, fiscal, or social exposure to climate risks, and wherever possible, support long-term resilience and a just transition to climate neutrality. And so in this definition, you see that next to suggesting a specific perspective on climate risk, which is intended to capture also indirect risks, this definition also highlights the need to actively support climate goals and identify opportunities to do so. When thinking about how MDBs could go about in ensuring Paris alignment of policy actions, we first looked at the way in which PBOs are typically being designed at MDBs. And in doing so, we've tried to highlight how robust climate considerations can be and should be integrated in critical steps of the PBO process, starting from the diagnostics and the dialogue with the partner country to the donor coordination and the formulation of policy actions and also results indicators. I don't have time to go into any more detail on this now, but what I would like to stress is that revisions to the process to more systematically integrate climate considerations in all steps and from the very beginning should not be so much regarded as an addition to the screening of policy actions for harmful elements, but rather as a necessary precondition to be able to arrive at Paris-aligned policy actions in the first place. This is just a brief impression of our analysis of policy actions in 3 policy areas: public financial management, public sector management, and energy. So here you see the public sector management example, where we categorize the policy actions and then try to identify the potential for significant harm and the potential for climate co-benefits for a number of subcategories. So we did this to provide some ideas for an approach and for things to consider when negotiating and drafting policy actions. So the main recommendations we derive from our findings are based on the notion that PBOs can actually support ambitious climate action and maximize development impact, and that if we want partner countries to request such PBOs, there's a couple of things that banks and shareholders can do to facilitate this demand. So this requires, on the one hand, stepping up MDB analysis and technical assistance on climate, including by integrating climate into macro-fiscal assessments, into social impact assessments, and institutional and policy assessments, and also support this internally through guidance and training. Also, MDBs should use technical assistance to better integrate climate in country strategies, and they should include climate-specific results, indicators, and projects. Also assess impacts and generate lessons learned for improving results in future PBOs. So this actually echoes lots of the things that have just been mentioned by the previous speakers. For shareholders and other DFIs, our main recommendations are to set additional incentives for climate-supportive policy-based operations by co-financing such projects with grants, and to bolster coordination, for example, via country or regional platforms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anya, for sharing the results of your work on PBOs and for sharing with some of your insight on what can be done to maximize the impact of PBOs. I think this is really interesting and will mirror what Alice is about to show us. Alice is one of my colleagues. She's a product officer at I4CE, and she's been working on financial intermediation, so she also has some interesting insights on how to assess and improve the alignment of financial intermediaries. Floor is yours, Alice.
Thank you very much, Claire. I hope that you can all hear me well. Yeah. So yes, we wanted also to present you some outcomes of a research project that we have just launched. Is that okay? On financial intermediaries, because we have been a lot discussing about mobilizing private finance and the need for new instruments and for additional instruments to mobilize climate finance. But international finance institutions also have an opportunity as well to change financial sector practices through their engagement with financial intermediaries. So not only looking at operations and end projects, but also looking at actors individually and systems. So we have started to work on a project together with colleagues from New Climate Institute, building on a paper that was released last year that was launched by German Watch, WRI, and New Climate Institute, and that presented a proposed assessment framework to assess the alignment of financial intermediaries. So all these local financial institutions that IFIs are working with, and to really assess whether their portfolios were aligned both with mitigation and adaptation objectives, and also proposing some key recommendations to assess as well the governance as well as the transparency frameworks of these institutions. And so the idea of this new research project that we are launching with New Climate Institute is to go a step forward and to compare the different frameworks that have been launched by international finance institutions. We have seen the MDBs releasing some approaches, the French Development Agency as well last week, and to provide some recommendations for ambitious and rigorous alignment frameworks moving forward to really have an impact at scale, and to also provide recommendations on how to also support these financial intermediaries in this journey and to move towards the implementation. So maybe I will just start representing again that indeed international finance institutions have started to align with the Paris Agreement objectives. They have started looking at their direct operations ensuring that they are doing no harm across all of their operations, and more trying to have the most impact possible for the transition of systems and economies. Now they are looking at these indirect financial operations. This is a new area of work for them, but this is an area of work that could have a transformative impact if it's done well and if it's done at scale. So a number of international finance institutions have already started to engage with their financial intermediaries to help them foster and develop green projects on the ground and finance this project on the ground. This is the case, for example, of EBRD, AFD, ICD as well. They have developed these green credit lines that are already a key first step for these local financial institutions to start integrate climate considerations within their operations. But now they also need to help them to stop these non-aligned activities. So this is something new, and a number of international finance institutions are now considering the development and implementation of new due diligence processes to help as well these local financial institutions to really stop these non-aligned activities. And what we have heard and what we clearly see from the research that we are doing is that there is a need for international finance institutions to coordinate and to move toward an harmonization of these due diligence processes, especially as they are talking to the same clients, to the same financial institutions. And if collectively they set a strong and ambitious alignment criteria for their financial intermediaries, this could send a strong signal to financial markets locally. In terms of the recommendation of these due diligences that we will provide, we would highly recommend that this starts on the basis of a quantitative assessment of the portfolio, looking at concretely what these local institutions are financing, and also to complement this by a qualitative assessment of how climate change is mainstreamed within the organization. What is the capacity of the institutions? What are the resources that they have internally to ensure that these assessments are made? And finally, to also include, in addition to that, a forward-looking assessment that should be clearly leading as well the conversation and the dialogue with financial intermediaries. And this should be a context-based qualitative assessment of the institution's level of ambition moving forward. Sorry. But today we are not there yet, and indeed international finance institutions are clearly facing a number of constraints. Indeed, the access to data is difficult. It is very difficult for international finance institutions to know what financial intermediaries are investing in. It is also difficult for them to engage on Paris alignment, as a number of financial intermediaries are just starting their climate mainstreaming journey. So they need to take these first steps, and are not able already for a number of them to already develop a transition plan. So there is a need to accompany them in this journey. And today there is also no clear understanding, as Ahmed was saying, no clear understanding of what is the long-term strategy and what is the pathway that the countries will be following for the transition. So this is also a lack of data that is clearly needed to move forward. And finally, while a number of regulators across the world are starting to integrate climate risk management requirements for their financial intermediaries, we are still far from having requirements with regards to Paris alignment and regards to the impact of financial institutions on the transition. So this is also the reason why to align financial intermediaries with the Paris Agreement objective, international financial institutions really need to support the consistency of local financial system. And indeed, they are well placed to create these enabling conditions for financial intermediaries to align with the Paris Agreement, as they can offer capacity building, as they can also engage and provide support for national governments as well in defining these long-term strategies, in defining these sectoral strategies and financing plans for the transition. And they can also engage with regulators locally to also help them progressively develop voluntary and mandatory requirements for an orderly transition. However, to do that, they need the mandate and the resources to do it, to engage in these different areas at the scale that is needed. So I will stop there, and I look forward for the discussion with the panelists.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alice, for sharing with us your recommendations on how best to assess and support financial intermediaries with their journey towards climate mainstreaming. I think you've given us, both Anya and Alice have given us quite a few avenues that can be explored on how to move forward with this. I think now is a good time to listen to the financial institutions and their representatives that we have with us today on their views of how in practice this can be done. I just wanted to check, because I think one of our panelists hasn't arrived yet and has been caught up. Just wanted to check that Dana wasn't with us in the room, but I believe she's been caught up. So I guess we'll just start the discussion without her. So we gave you you three two questions to reflect on when we were preparing this discussion. The first one was related to the opportunities that you see as practitioners, financial institutions, the opportunities that are available today and the avenues that can be explored to have this transformative impact, both in terms of the instruments that you can use and maybe more broadly of the sectors and items you can be working on. So I think maybe we can start with you, Vito. I'll probably sit next to you now. We've got one of the panelists that hasn't arrived. We'll probably start with you, Vito, if that's okay, if you could give us your views on these opportunities.
Slides, are they going to... Yes, they should be coming up. All right. Just because I don't like the feedback, I'm going to stand up and step over there. Yeah, all right, thanks. Sorry, I'm going to be right next. I'm going to be right next to you if you're okay with it. The feedback was driving me nuts. Well, I guess before they put up the two slides, I can maybe give you a little bit of background as to who I am and why I'm here. My name is Vito Delerba. I work for Canada's second largest pension plan. The plan has 400 billion Canadian dollars in assets, and within that plan, I manage a portfolio of 4 billion Canadian dollars in what's called quasi-sovereign fixed income in emerging markets. So I help governments build strategic projects across the world. And so the backbone of what I'm going to present to you today really comes from my experience as a practitioner within the space. And since this is one of my last panels, I thought I'd be a little bit more provocative than I have been all week. So you're going to get to see some stuff that I really haven't put out there. Maybe the prior slide, please. I'm going to show you two slides. They look a little busy, but I'm going to walk through them. I wanted to give a solution. I wanted to explain to you what this means in practice, because all I've been hearing about are what the problems are, how we need to fix the MDBs, how we need to mobilize private sector capital, and it's all very high level and it actually doesn't go in the ground. We've been thinking about an actual solution that brings together all of these parties to basically mobilize private sector capital at scale for emerging markets, climate adaptation, and mitigation finance. Now, I said I wouldn't talk about problems, but in order to get to the solution, it's always important to have a very clear view as to what the problem statement is in order to build your solution around that problem statement. And so this is the only time I'm going to talk about the problem. This is, in essence, what I like to call the value chain of the life cycle of a transaction. And the problems that you're going to see here in this value chain are things that I come across when originating directly in emerging markets. CDPQ is a direct investor. 90% of its assets are actually put on the books by the investment people. And so what you see is that as you start going into the markets and you start talking about NDCs and NAPs of the countries that you're trying to finance, there's a number of issues that come up. And I really love something that Norbert said when he was on the panel prior. He said, I wrote it down, the financial system is not fit for purpose. I thought that was great. And he also said that 3 of the 4 items in their review was around mobilizing private sector capital. And what we were hearing from the MDBs is that we need to mobilize their capital, but one statistic that I've been using this week is that traditional institutional investors were 900 times the size of the MDBs combined, so we're massive. So we have to find solutions that are fit for purpose to mobilize us. Now, how do we do that? Well, the problem is that we realize that there's limited institutional capacity locally to actually make these deals happen. When you talk to governments from Central America to Asia to Africa, a lot of those NDCs and NAPs have been created by consultants and are a piece of paper that they don't know how to implement. And so you end up having conversations around, hey, how do I get these deals done? I want to use your capital, but I don't know how to actually build a deal. That's at the real early stage. This is where project preparation happens. Then, let's say those transactions are actually built, you need to get into an environment where you actually have to measure the impact. This is offensive impact rationale. We need clear climate rationale to build those climate projects, both in mitigation and adaptation. But when you ask local authorities how to actually create a baseline for an adaptation project, blank stares. And so you need consultants, you need to develop technical assistance available to get these countries to actually do the work that they need to do. This here is the realm mostly of multilateral development banks. It's not the realm of institutional investors. So we'll get to that in a second. The next issue is that I write $200 to $400 million checks. That's my average check size. I can't walk into a credit committee with something less than $100 million. The majority of these projects, $5 to $75 million. And the further out you go on the frontier, the smaller and smaller they become. Very hard for me to aggregate these types of transactions, and so I need to build a network that allows me to aggregate small deals into platform structures so that I can deploy large amounts of capital constantly. So I basically have to create a machine. The other issue, and I'm not going to get into why this issue, and I won't say who the actors are that create this situation, but the risk-adjusted return of many of these transactions are not attractive to me relative to the universe of fixed income investors. I'm an absolute return investor. I look for transactions that are at or above the efficient frontier of all fixed income investments in the world, from US high yields to mortgages in Europe. It doesn't matter. So if the transaction that I'm finding in Africa doesn't equal or is better, I can't do it. So we need to figure out how to realign the risk-adjusted returns. So that's what we're trying to solve for. Now, if you thought that the problem was simple, it's not. The financial system is not fit for purpose, and that's exactly what we heard. So the solution has to be unique. It has to be something we haven't done before. And all I've been hearing here, it's my first COP, all I've been hearing at this COP is institutional investors are not showing up, and we need to mobilize the MDBs. Actually, what we need to be doing is thinking of different blueprints that can be used by different actors where we all collaborate together to solve a problem that before was compartmentalized and siloed, and today requires collaboration. And there's one solution in the world, and it can be used at scale, and it's very powerful because the whole is much stronger than its parts. Can I ask you to go to the next slide, please? Now, I know it looks busy, but I'm going to walk you through it, okay? This is the solution to the problems that you saw. The way we're looking at this is to actually think of the whole life cycle of a deal. Cradle to grave is what I call it. We need to be preparing these projects, and so you need to create upstream development facilities that are capable of crowding in local stakeholders, climate experts, advocates, global north, global south, everybody in the room to actually create the solution to the problem. And that's something that's not being done. So it's the first thing you need to do. The second thing you need to do is actually, when you build it, think about this. What if you have a sustainable agricultural project in India, and then this facility becomes a facility used by institutional investors to build traditional sustainable agricultural projects in Central America and in Africa? All this information has to be democratized and given to the market so that you can actually copy these things over and over. Now, when you're done with the project preparation, you need to connect it to last mile technical assistance. Like I said, the impact measurement capabilities of these borrowers is not as high as it needs to be, at least for now. And mostly these technical assistance facilities are going to be attached to a capital stack, which means that when the project is ready, the investor is ready to walk in. Now, the only way you can originate these transactions is because they're small, is you got to build an origination network of partners across the world. And so you need large players that have tentacles in many different markets at once. That's how you find the deals. Once you found the deals, you need your capital structure. You need the money to be able to lend. I'm a fixed income investor, so I build fixed income capital stacks to lend money long-term into infrastructure projects. But what's important here is to solve the problems about what I said before. There are tools out there, and we hear about it all the time. Subordinated concessional capital, guarantees, FX hedging, which is a problem. Depends who you are, depends what your objective is. But the goal is to actually marry all of these things together, find the right partners, philanthropies, public sector providers, DFIs, IFIs, to actually build a capital stack that works for you, but at the same time, that works for the borrower. That's what's important, because you're creating a product that some borrower is going to need to use to solve a climate issue. So it's competitive out there. You have to have an interesting product, and all of that has to come into consideration when building the capital stack. And the last piece, you don't want to be mired in doing deals for 5 years. We need to be quick and nimble. I got to get transactions out the door every 6 months. If I want to deploy billions at scale, we're not going to spend 5 years doing this. And so what we need to do is actually have an execution methodology that's quick, nimble, and agile. You set up a council, some sort of investment committee that gets managed independently, and all of a sudden, you start deploying the money that you need. This holistic approach, where you're the first ones that I've shown this to, here at COP, this holistic approach is way beyond anything that an institutional investor used to do not even 20 years ago when we bought stocks and bonds on the market. This is outside the realm of what's being done today. And the answer and solution, I go back to a complex problem, has to be collaborative, and it has to actually be somewhat complex because you need to do things you've never done before. So the answer is, there's a $1.4 trillion gap out there, or whatever the gap of the trillions of dollars that we talk about. To a financier like me, that tells me that there is a massive market opportunity. And so rather than thinking of it like a crisis, think of trying to come up with different blueprints that allow you to access the opportunity. And right now, it seems like people are just talking to one another, or at each other. So we need to start talking together, and this is how you do it.
Wow. Thank you very much, Vito, for sharing, for letting us be the first ones you share these slides with. I saw a few people taking photographs here in the audience, so it was really interesting, and I think it gave us a very good idea of how blended finance can have a transformative impact and how it's important to mainstream it across the different the life cycle of the project impacts. I think I'm going to pass it over now to Alexi, who's going to share his ideas on the opportunity that we can have to have a transformative impact. I'm going to pass it over to you.
No, I don't have slides. Yes, thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity, and many thanks also for this rich conversation, taking in the ideas of many speakers here. Well, to start, I also wanted to pick up on Norbert's observation at the previous panel that the financial system is not fit for purpose. And when you listen to Norbert telling us that as a shareholder and a government representative, it tells you very many things about what might need to be done. The first observation here is that it's surprising that it's not fit for purpose, because for many years now, the system, the financial system has, and many of the stakeholders, at least within the system, have been doing or have engaged into a quiet revolution where slowly but surely they have made progress in terms of integrating environmental, social dimensions, climate dimensions to all of what they do. I remember a few years ago, the discussion on aligning with the Paris Agreement was focusing at the project level. Now we have presentations which are focusing at policy or counterpart level. That's a sign of progress. And that's part of what I call the quiet revolution that we are all have been engaging in. But yet, the observation at the end is that we're not there yet. It's not fit for purpose. And actually, when you look at the bulk of finance that is being invested today around the planet, it's not aligned with the Paris Agreement or the SDGs. And all of that despite all the progress that has been made. So the question here is whether we are doing this at the system level good enough, and whether the sum of incremental action can lead to systemic change. And I just wanted to develop a little more on that. When the Finance in Common Summit, which is the coalition of all development banks around the world, started its journey 2 years ago with the launching summit that took place, gathering for the first time all development banks around the planet. The question we asked to all participants was exactly the one that you're asking here. What is needed to improve impact and be transformational? They came up with 5 answers to that question. The first one, we discussed it in the previous panel, is about the mandates and the role of the shareholders that should be more explicit in terms of asking their development banks to work on climate and fully integrate and mainstream climate in all of what they do. First answer of that community. The second answer of that community was about the regulatory context. Public development banks quite often do not have enough incentives, even if they had a mandate, a very clear and ambitious mandate on climate. They have some regulatory constraints that sometimes prevent them from taking risks at the scale that is needed, or in terms of accountability and accounting for their performance in exchange of maybe a bit more of risk-taking. The third area that was highlighted was the one about what is a climate-aligned or a climate co-beneficial investment. And many different institutions have different answers to that question. And there is a need to develop a common language around what is defined as something that is climate compatible. And there is a lot of confusion these days. I mean, many of you know that there is a conversation about net zero targets for financial institutions. What is a net zero target for a financial institution? Shall each financial institution of the planet be net zero, or shall it contribute to the global net zero? And who defines what is that contribution in that case, and how do you split the effort? That's one part of the conversation. Another one is whether a net zero strategy is equal to an alignment strategy. Is that the same thing, or is it different? And are we talking about 1.5 degrees, about 2 degrees? Are we talking about something else, which is a degree target, but also the wider context of the Paris Agreement? Many discussions around those issues also. And if there's not a lot of coherence there, action will be implemented in many directions, and we will end up not having a systemic impact at the end of the day. Third, that was a third element that was brought together by the coalition of all development banks in terms of areas for improvement and opportunities as well. A fourth area is about the business models of development banks, and this has been discussed already by previous speakers, and including just now about how we could have a different approach to blended finance by being more holistic. All of that, I think, has an impact on the way development banks can carry out their business. And at the end of the day, it's about making this change or making development banks evolve from being SDG takers, which they often are. I mean, there's a good SDG project out there. It requires a little bit of concessional finance. Here we go, we finance the project, we've done our job. That's perfect, that's fine, but the impact you have is equal to the impact of that given project. And what's next? Maybe you send a few market signals when you do that, but you don't have a theory of change in terms of enabling transformation behind the project that you financed. So moving from SDG takers to SDG makers is actually another quite revolution that many development banks are engaging in, and that's about really looking more at not only the project level but also at the counterpart level and the policy level, the pathway level. That is something that you should try to enable as much as you can, and it's not always through projects. In that case, what happens to the financial equilibrium of a development bank? I mean, the usual business of a development bank is about lending, right? And through the proceeds of the lending, it's not for profit, of course, but you manage to carry out the business. Now, if your focus of attention is a lot more towards soft elements or non-financial elements, technical assistance, helping project preparation, building networks to ensure that there is a collaborative effort that is in place, discussing policies and strategies with key stakeholders, working on political economy assessments to see where you can have the biggest impact and with whom and when doing what. All of that has not generated any single loan, and therefore the financial equilibrium of development banking is at stake. So here there's a reflection, and that was brought forward as a fourth element to the discussion by the Finance in Commons Summit. And then there was a fifth one, which is about improving collaboration, at least within the development bank community and also with many other financial stakeholders. So these 5 elements are the ones where I
particularly around climate, and should have to have plans. But there's a whole range of other regulatory actions. So I think, certainly there needs to be this clear alignment between those regulatory changes happening in the US, EU, but many other countries as well, in Asia as well, development of taxonomies, etc. And together with the kind of shift that we need to see on the public finance side. And then just finally to conclude, it sounded like, and something that we certainly agree with, that there needs to be a real kind of convening space for greater collaboration in the MDB space, in the IFI space, which is focused on collaboration, but also on effective decision making, and but also this kind of accountability frameworks, as we just heard from the representative from AFD, which I think is such a key conversation that we're having right now. We've looked at, on the private finance side, what's happening with G-funds and the kind of pushback we're seeing. It is really important that institutions are held to account for what they have committed to publicly, and what can we do as a broader community to ensure, as Dana was saying, that there is a clear pathway for all of the institutions that we need to shift capital, and what does that pathway really look like? So thanks very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for summarising the discussions really well, and I think we've collectively identified a certain number of topics for us to work on over the next year and coming years. Thank you very much for that. I'd like to extend the thank you to our panellists that were here with us today, and also to the ones, Anya, Alice, that presented in the second part. Thank you very much, and yeah, we look forward to continuing these discussions throughout the year. Thank you, all of you.